October 4th, 1993. Moscow, Russia. Boris Yeltsin stood at the window of his Kremlin office, watching smoke rise from the Russian White House across the Moscow River. The building that had been the symbol of Russian democracy, the building where he had stood on a tank 2 years earlier to defy a communist coup, was now under assault by tanks firing on his orders. The sound of artillery echoed across Moscow. Tank shells slammed into the upper floors of the White House, sending plumes of smoke and debris into the air. Machine gun fire rattled. Soldiers advanced on the building, preparing to storm it and remove the parliamentary leaders who had barricaded themselves inside for the past 2 weeks. Yeltsin took a long drink of vodka, his hand trembling slightly. This was not how it was supposed to be. This was not the democracy he had promised when the Soviet Union collapsed. This was not the future he had envisioned when he stood on that tank in August 1991, calling on Russians to resist the hardline communist coup plotters. But here he was, ordering Russian soldiers to fire on the Russian parliament. Here he was, using military force against his own people. Here he was, acting like the very dictators he had spent his career opposing. "Mr. President," said Pavel Grachev, the defense minister, entering the office, "the assault has begun. The tanks are firing on the upper floors where the resistance is concentrated. Our troops will enter the building within the hour." Yeltsin turned from the window, his face flushed, his eyes bloodshot. "How many casualties?" Grachev hesitated. "We don't have exact numbers yet, Mr. President, but there will be casualties. The defenders are armed. They're firing back. This won't be bloodless." Yeltsin slumped into his chair, suddenly looking much older than his 62 years. "This is a nightmare, Pavel, an absolute nightmare. Russian soldiers firing on the Russian parliament. This is what we fought against. This is what we tried to prevent when we defeated the coup in 1991. Grachev said carefully, "Mr. President, you had no choice. The parliament was in open rebellion. They tried to seize power. They called for your overthrow. They sent armed militias to attack the television station and the mayor's office. If you hadn't acted, there would have been civil war." Yeltsin knew Grachev was right, but it didn't make him feel any better. The past 2 weeks had been the worst of his presidency, worse even than the August 1991 coup attempt. Because in 1991, the lines had been clear: Democrats versus communist hardliners, reformers versus reactionaries, the future versus the past. But now, in October 1993, the lines were blurred. Both sides claimed to represent democracy. Both sides claimed constitutional legitimacy. Both sides accused the other of dictatorship. It had started in September when Yeltsin, frustrated by constant parliamentary obstruction of his reforms, had issued a decree dissolving parliament and calling for new elections. The parliament, led by Speaker Ruslan Khasbulatov and Vice President Alexander Rutskoy, had refused to accept the decree. They had voted to impeach Yeltsin and sworn in Rutskoy as acting president. Russia suddenly had 2 presidents, 2 governments, 2 competing claims to legitimacy. For 2 weeks, the standoff had continued. Yeltsin had cut off power and water to the White House, trying to force the parliament to surrender. The parliamentarians had barricaded themselves inside, calling on Russians to rise up against Yeltsin's dictatorship. Crowds of supporters had gathered outside the White House, some of them armed, some of them violent, all of them angry at Yeltsin and his reforms. And then, on October 3rd, the situation had exploded. Armed supporters of the parliament had broken through police lines and marched on the Ostankino television center, trying to seize control of Russian state television. They had attacked the mayor's office. They had called for a general uprising against Yeltsin. Dozens of people had been killed in the fighting. Yeltsin had been at his dacha outside Moscow when the violence erupted. His advisors had called him urgently, "Mr. President, you need to act now. If you don't use force to crush this rebellion, you'll lose control of Moscow. There will be civil war." Yeltsin had made his decision. He had ordered the military to storm the White House, to arrest the parliamentary leaders, to end the rebellion by force, and he had given the order knowing what it meant. Russian soldiers firing on a Russian government building, tanks shelling the symbol of Russian democracy, blood in the streets of Moscow. Now standing in the Kremlin, watching the assault unfold, Yeltsin felt the weight of that decision crushing down on him. He poured himself another drink, his hands shaking. "What am I going to tell the Russian people?" Yeltsin asked Grachev. "How do I explain this? How do I justify ordering tanks to fire on the parliament?" Grachev said, "You tell them the truth, Mr. President. You tell them that the parliament was in armed rebellion, that they tried to overthrow the legitimate government, that they attacked the television station and the mayor's office, that you had no choice but to restore order by force." Yeltsin shook his head. "But that's what the communists used to say. That's how they justified every crackdown, every use of force against dissent. We had to restore order. We had to crush the rebellion. We had to protect the state. And now I'm saying the same things." He stood up and walked back to the window, watching the smoke rise from the White House. "Do you know what they're going to call me, Pavel? They're going to call me a dictator. They're going to say I destroyed Russian democracy. They're going to compare me to the communist hardliners who tried to crush reform. And maybe they'll be right." Grachev said firmly, "No, Mr. President. You're not a dictator. You're trying to save Russian democracy from people who would destroy it. Khasbulatov and Rutskoy don't represent democracy. They represent the old Soviet system, the old communist ways. They want to turn back the clock, to undo all the reforms, to return Russia to authoritarianism." Yeltsin wanted to believe that. He wanted to believe that he was the defender of democracy, that his opponents were the real authoritarians, that using force was justified to prevent a greater catastrophe. But doubt gnawed at him, because the truth was more complicated than either side wanted to admit. The truth was that Russia in 1993 was a mess. The economy was collapsing, inflation was out of control, people's savings had been wiped out, state enterprises were closing, unemployment was soaring, crime was rampant. The social safety net that had existed under communism had disappeared, and nothing had replaced it. Millions of Russians were suffering, and they blamed Yeltsin and his reforms. The parliament represented those angry, suffering Russians. They represented the workers who had lost their jobs, the pensioners who couldn't afford food, the military officers who hadn't been paid in months, the Soviet-era bureaucrats who had lost their power and privileges. They represented everyone who felt that Yeltsin's reforms had destroyed their lives and given them nothing in return. And they had a point. Yeltsin's shock therapy economic reforms had been brutal. Prices had been freed overnight, causing massive inflation. State subsidies had been eliminated. Industries had been privatized, often in corrupt deals that enriched a small group of oligarchs while leaving ordinary Russians impoverished. The reforms had been necessary. The Soviet economic system was unsustainable, but they had been implemented in a way that caused immense suffering. So when the parliament opposed Yeltsin, when they tried to slow down or reverse his reforms, they weren't just being obstructionist. They were representing millions of Russians who were desperate, angry, and afraid. And when Yeltsin dissolved the parliament, when he used tanks to crush the opposition, he wasn't just defending democracy. He was also defending his own power, his own vision, his own determination to push through reforms regardless of the cost. Yeltsin understood all of this. He understood that the situation was more complex than his advisors wanted to admit. But he also believed that he had no choice. If he backed down, if he let the parliament win, the reforms would be reversed. Russia would slide back toward authoritarianism, toward isolation, toward the failed Soviet system. Everything he had fought for would be lost. So he had made his decision. He had ordered the assault, and now he had to live with the consequences. The phone rang. It was Grachev. "Mr. President, our forces have entered the White House. The defenders are surrendering. Khasbulatov and Rutskoy are in custody. The rebellion is over." Yeltsin felt a wave of relief, followed immediately by a wave of nausea. It was over. The crisis was resolved. But at what cost? "Casualties?" Yeltsin asked. We're still getting reports, Mr. President, but it looks like at least 100 dead. Maybe more. Most of them defenders of the White House and their supporters. Some soldiers. Some civilians caught in the crossfire. 100 dead. 100 Russians killed in fighting between Russians. 100 people who had died because Boris Yeltsin had ordered tanks to fire on the parliament. Yeltsin hung up the phone and sat down heavily. He needed to address the nation. He needed to explain what had happened, to justify the use of force, to reassure Russians that democracy would continue despite the violence. But what could he say? How could he explain this? His speechwriters brought him a draft. He read through it, making notes, crossing out phrases, adding new ones. The speech needed to be firm, but not triumphant. It needed to justify the use of force, but also express regret. It needed to blame the parliament for the violence, while also acknowledging the suffering of ordinary Russians. At 8 p.m. Moscow time, Yeltsin appeared on television. He sat at his desk, his face grave, his voice steady but somber. Citizens of Russia, I address you at a difficult moment in our nation's history. Today, Russian military forces stormed the White House to end an armed rebellion against the legitimate government of Russia. This was a decision I did not make lightly. It was a decision forced upon me by the actions of those who chose violence over democracy, who chose rebellion over law, who chose to plunge Russia into chaos rather than accept the will of the people. He paused, then continued. For 2 weeks, the former parliament, led by Ruslan Khasbulatov and Alexander Rutskoy, has been in open rebellion against the Russian government. They refused to accept my decree dissolving parliament and calling for new elections. They declared themselves the legitimate government. They called on Russians to rise up and overthrow the constitutional order. Yeltsin's voice grew firmer. And yesterday, their supporters turned to violence. Armed groups attacked the Ostankino television center. They attacked the mayor's office. They killed police officers and civilians. They tried to seize control of Moscow by force. This was not democracy. This was not peaceful protest. This was armed insurrection. He leaned forward, looking directly into the camera. I had a choice. I could allow the violence to continue, allow Moscow to descend into chaos, allow Russia to slide into civil war, or I could act decisively to restore order, to crush the rebellion, to defend the constitutional government. I chose to act. I ordered the military to storm the White House and arrest the leaders of the rebellion. That order has been carried out. Then came the difficult part, the acknowledgement of the cost. I deeply regret that this action was necessary. I regret the loss of life. I regret that Russian soldiers had to fire on a Russian government building. I regret that blood was shed in the streets of Moscow. But I had no choice. The alternative was civil war, chaos, the destruction of everything we have built since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Yeltsin continued, his voice becoming more passionate. Let me be clear about something. I'm not a dictator. I did not dissolve Parliament because I want absolute power. I dissolved Parliament because it had become an obstacle to reform, a barrier to progress, a tool of those who want to turn back the clock and return Russia to the failed Soviet system. He explained his reasoning. The Parliament elected in 1990 represented the old Soviet system. It was dominated by former communists, by Soviet-era bureaucrats, by people who opposed every reform, who fought against every change, who wanted to preserve their power and privileges at the expense of the Russian people. That parliament had no legitimacy in the new Russia. It did not represent the will of the people. It represented the past, not the future. Yeltsin then made his promise. I've called for new parliamentary elections in December. The Russian people will elect a new parliament, one that truly represents them, one that will work with the government to build a democratic, prosperous Russia. This is not the end of democracy. This is democracy defending itself against those who would destroy it. He concluded with a direct appeal. I know many of you are suffering. I know the economic reforms have been painful. I know prices are high, jobs are scarce, life is difficult. I understand your anger and your frustration, but the answer is not to go back to the Soviet system. The answer is not to embrace those who promise easy solutions and a return to the past. The answer is to continue moving forward, to continue building a free, democratic, market-based Russia. Yeltsin's voice softened. The road ahead will not be easy. There will be more challenges, more difficulties, more sacrifices. But I believe in Russia. I believe in the Russian people. I believe that we will overcome these challenges and build a better future for our children and grandchildren. That is what I am fighting for. That is why I made the difficult decision to use force today. Not for power, not for personal gain, but for Russia's future. After the speech, Yeltsin sat alone in his office, drinking vodka, staring at the television coverage of the White House assault. The building was burning. Smoke poured from the upper floors. Soldiers were leading prisoners out, their hands behind their heads. The symbol of Russian democracy was in ruins. Yeltsin thought about August 1991, when he had stood on a tank outside this same building, defying the communist coup plotters, calling on Russians to defend democracy. Thousands had rallied to his side. The coup had failed. The Soviet Union had collapsed. Democracy had triumphed. But now, just 2 years later, he was the one ordering tanks to fire on the parliament. He was the one using military force against his political opponents. He was the one acting like a dictator, even as he insisted he was defending democracy. Was he right? Had he made the right decision? Or had he destroyed the very democracy he claimed to be defending? Yeltsin didn't know. History would judge. But in that moment, sitting alone in the Kremlin, watching the White House burn, he felt the terrible weight of power, the awful burden of leadership, the crushing responsibility of making decisions that would determine the fate of millions. His chief of staff, Sergei Filatov, entered the office. Mr. President, the international reaction is coming in. The United States and European nations are expressing concern about the use of force. But they're also saying they understand your position. They're calling for a return to constitutional order and new elections. Yeltsin nodded. And the domestic reaction? Filatov hesitated. Mixed, Mr. President. Some people support you, say you had no choice, that you saved Russia from chaos. Others are horrified, say you've become a dictator, that you've destroyed democracy. And many are just confused, frightened, unsure what this means for Russia's future. Yeltsin stood up and walked to the window one more time. The White House was still burning. The smoke was visible across Moscow, a black stain against the evening sky. You know what the tragedy is, Sergei, Yeltsin said quietly. The tragedy is that both sides believed they were defending democracy. Kasbulatov and Rutskoy believed they were protecting the parliament, protecting the constitution, protecting Russia from a would-be dictator. And I believed I was protecting reform, protecting progress, protecting Russia from a return to the Soviet past. He continued. Both sides believed they were right. Both sides believed the other side was destroying democracy. And so we ended up with tanks firing on the parliament, with Russian soldiers killing Russian citizens with the symbol of our democracy in flames. Filatov said, "But you won, Mr. President. The rebellion is crushed. You remain in power. You can continue the reforms." Yeltsin turned and looked at his chief of staff with tired, bloodshot eyes. Did I win? Or did I just prove that Russian democracy is too fragile to survive, that we are not ready for democracy, that we need a strong hand to keep order? Did I save democracy, or did I kill it? Filatov had no answer. Yeltsin walked back to his desk and poured another drink. Schedule the elections for December. Let the people choose a new parliament, and let's hope they choose wisely, because if this happens again, if we have another constitutional crisis, another armed confrontation, I don't think Russian democracy will survive. In the days that followed, the full extent of the violence became clear. The official death toll was 147, though some estimates put it much higher. Thousands were wounded. The White House was gutted by fire. The parliamentary leaders were arrested and charged with organizing armed rebellion, though they would later be amnestied. Yeltsin pushed through a new constitution that greatly strengthened presidential power at the expense of the parliament. The December elections produced a new parliament, but it was still dominated by opponents of Yeltsin's reforms. The constitutional crisis was resolved, but the underlying conflicts remained. And Boris Yeltsin, the man who had stood on a tank to defend democracy in 1991, would forever be remembered as the man who ordered tanks to fire on the parliament in 1993. Hero and villain, Democrat and authoritarian, reformer and destroyer, the White House burned, and Russian democracy burned with it.